Man outside the window. Part 1. Moving Alexander, a 30-year-old programmer, moved to a new house on the outskirts of the city after many years of living in a noisy metropolis. He was tired of the endless hum of cars, rushing people, and the constant pressure that haunted him every day. Finding himself in a quiet and secluded area, he hoped to find peace and quiet, far from the worries and bustle of the city. The house stood on the edge of a dense forest, which made it even more secluded. The house itself looked old but well kept. It was built in the middle of the last century and until recently belonged to an elderly couple who sold it to move closer to their children. Alexander immediately felt that it was the perfect place for a new life. Spacious rooms, a large backyard, and windows overlooking the forest. The first days after moving were calm. Alexander unpacked his things, set up the internet, and tidied up the house. Sometimes in the evenings he walked around the neighborhood, enjoying the fresh air and the singing of the birds, of which there were many in the forest. The only source of light at night were street lamps, which dimly illuminated the road to the house. A dense forest spread out beyond the bedroom windows, which gave the nights a special mystery. Alexander happily noticed how his nervous system gradually calmed down and his sleep became stronger. But one night something changed. Part 2. First appearance. It was an ordinary night. Alexander went to bed around midnight, feeling pleasantly tired after a day spent in domestic routine. His bedroom was spacious, with a large window through which sunlight penetrated the room in the morning, illuminating it with warm rays. At night, darkness reigned outside the window. The forest stretched for many kilometers, and even the nearest trees seemed like black silhouettes against the dark sky. Alexander liked to fall asleep to the sounds of the forest, sometimes hearing rustling sounds, animal sounds, or the wind walking between the trees through the open window. But that night he was awakened by a strange feeling. At first he thought it was some kind of nightmare. He dreamed that someone was standing outside the window. The dream was so vivid that Alexander woke up abruptly, feeling cold sweat on his back. Opening his eyes, he lay in the darkness for a while, trying to come to his senses. Something was wrong. Alexander felt goosebumps run across his skin, and then he looked out the window. For a moment he thought he saw something moving in the darkness beyond the glass, like a human figure standing among the trees. It was only a faint outline, barely visible in the night, but still clear enough to make his heart beat faster. He sat up in bed and squinted, trying to see something better. The shadow seemed motionless, standing right at the edge of the light, as if watching him. This continued for several minutes, and Alexander began to doubt that he had seen anything real. In the end, he decided that it was a trick of light and shadow, and went back to sleep.
Part 3. The Shadow Returns. The next morning, Alexander had almost forgotten about the strange incident. The day passed as usual. He went about his business, worked remotely, and solved problems at work. But in the evening, when the sun began to set, thoughts about that night surfaced in his mind again. What was it? Just a shadow? Or something more? Night fell, and Alexander went to bed again. But this time he could not fall asleep so easily. He looked at the window, expecting to see the same figure that had appeared to him the night before. Time passed, the night deepened, and then, in the dark outline of the forest outside the window, a shadow appeared again. It stood in exactly the same place as the night before. At first, Alexander was scared, but trying to convince himself that it was just a coincidence, he got out of bed and slowly walked to the window. Up close, the figure looked like a human silhouette, but it was motionless and made no sounds. Alexander looked at it for several minutes, feeling his heart beat faster. He opened the window, letting in the cool night air. But the shadow remained in place, not moving an inch. Nothing disturbed the silence of the night. He thought it might be the shadow of a tree or just an optical illusion. Having calmed down a bit, he closed the window and went back to bed. But he couldn't fall asleep again. The next few days were a real test for Alexander. Every night the shadow outside the window returned. It always stood in the same place, motionless, silent, but all the more frightening. Alexander began to feel uncomfortable in his own home. He tried to ignore the night visions, but they seemed to haunt him. At first, he tried to find logical explanations. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, changing depending on how the moon illuminated the forest. Perhaps it really was the shadow of a tree he hadn't noticed before. But with each passing day, it became increasingly difficult to convince himself of this. One night, when the shadow appeared again, Alexander noticed something new. It was closer. It was no longer as far away as before, as if it had come closer to the house. It was barely noticeable, but still felt. The figure did not move while he watched, but with each new night it came closer to his window. Part 5. Invisible Presence. Alexander became obsessed with this shadow. He set up a camera aimed at the window to try to record what he saw. But the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, just a dark forest outside the window. No trace of a figure or movement. This confused him and made him even more worried. If the shadow existed only in his mind, what did that mean? Could he be going crazy? One day he tried to invite a friend over to spend the night and see the strange phenomenon. They spent the evening talking and watching movies, but when night fell, the friend still saw nothing strange. Alexander, on the contrary, noticed the figure outside the window again. It stood motionless, now even closer, almost at the edge of the forest, but the friend swore that he saw nothing. This convinced Alexander that something supernatural was happening around him. The shadow was visible only to him. The Part 6. Getting Closer. Every day the shadow grew closer. Now it stood right at the edge of the yard, just a few meters from his window. Alexander almost stopped sleeping. He sat by the window for hours, not taking his eyes off the shadow, which did not move, but each time it came closer. Fear took hold of him completely. At night, he began to hear whispers. They came from the street as if someone was calling his name. Part 7. Call from the Darkness. The whispers grew louder and louder. At night, lying awake, Alexander began to hear his name in the sounds, as if someone was calling him quietly and insistently. It wasn't just the rustling of the wind in the trees or the sounds of forest animals, it was something else. The sounds came from outside, exactly from the place where the mysterious figure stood. Sometimes the whispers sounded as if someone was right under his window. Alexander? Sounded quietly and drawn-outly in the night. He could no longer ignore it. The fear became so strong that one night, unable to bear it any longer, he decided to go outside and meet face-to-face with whoever was watching him. It was a quiet night without wind and without a moon. Darkness enveloped the house, and only the weak light of a street lamp cast long shadows on the ground. Alexander stood in front of the door, peering into the darkness. His hands were shaking, his breathing was uneven, but he gathered all the remaining courage in himself and took a step over the threshold. The silence was eerie. Even the familiar sounds of the forest seemed to have disappeared. Only his own footsteps broke the silence of the night. He approached the place where he usually saw the figure, but it was empty. No tracks, no movement. The forest was silent. But as soon as he turned around, he heard a rustling sound right behind him. Alexander froze. His heart began to beat so loudly that he could hear it in his ears. Slowly, with effort, he turned around, feeling cold sweat covering his forehead. And then he saw it. The shadow he had been watching all these days stood right in front of him, a few steps away. It looked more like a person now, but its features were blurred, as if someone had drawn it in the dark and then blurred the outlines. The face was empty, without eyes, without a mouth, but Alexander felt it looking right at him. At that moment he realized, this was not just a shadow. This was something ancient, eerie, and evil. Figure Alexander stepped back, feeling the ground slipping away from under his feet. He turned and ran back to the house, but the shadow followed him. It did not move like a normal person. Its movements were quick, jerky, as if it were teleporting short distances, each time coming closer. Fear consumed him completely. Reaching the door, he ran inside, slammed it shut, and locked all the locks. He pressed himself against the window, breathing heavily. The shadow was no longer visible from the outside, but he knew it was there, somewhere nearby. Part 8. Obsession. Several days had passed since that horrific encounter. Alexander had hardly left the house. He felt something changing inside him. Anxiety was growing in his soul, bordering on madness. He stopped eating, stopped working. His world narrowed to the bedroom windows and the figure that was getting closer to his house with each passing day. It seemed to him that the shadow was no longer just standing outside. It was everywhere. When he closed his eyes, he saw it. It haunted him even in his thoughts, like an inexorable threat, giving him no moment of peace. Every evening he waited in horror for its appearance. One evening, when Alexander was again watching the forest, the figure did something new. It raised its hand as if stretching it towards the window. This gesture made him go cold. He recoiled from the window but could not tear his gaze away. The next moment, the figure took another step. It was already within arm's reach of his house. Now there was no doubt. The shadow would come for him. Part 9. Mirror of Fear. At that moment, Alexander started looking for answers. He turned to the internet, forums, read about ghosts, shadow people, ancient creatures that could explain this phenomenon. He found many stories, legends, and tales, but nothing concrete. Each story was just another warning. Do not look at them. Do not interact. But he had already broken all possible prohibitions. He stepped outside again, this time fully prepared for what was to come. The moon was dim, illuminating the dark silhouettes of the trees, and there it was, a shadow standing right at the window, its arm outstretched. The next morning was strange. Alexander woke up with a heavy feeling, but the figure did not appear again. He thought that it was all over at last. Perhaps it was just a trick of his mind, a temporary madness that finally left him alone. But as night fell, he felt it again, not outside the house, but inside. The shadow was no longer outside the window, but in his bedroom. It appeared right in front of him as soon as he turned off the light. It was no longer just a blurry figure, it was his own double, but dark, empty, like a shadow. And then he realized it had always been inside. The shadow had not tried to enter his home. It had always been a part of him. This horror was not external, but internal, born of his own fear and loneliness. Part 11. The Finale. The last days of Alexander's life passed in complete silence. He no longer tried to fight, did not look for answers. The shadow became part of his reality, his consciousness. It followed him everywhere until it swallowed him completely. Several weeks passed before the neighbors noticed that Alexander was missing. His house was abandoned, the windows were closed, and there was an eerie silence inside. No one saw him again. The shadow outside the window no longer bothered anyone. And only at night, when the moonlight illuminated the bedroom, could one notice a faint silhouette in the window, standing motionless and watching the world from the other side.